And it goes something like this. Well, Father, all that religion stuff is nice, but really, I just want my kid to get a good SAT score. Jesus is a mascot, but it's not the important work. And honestly, that's not what I'm paying for.
I think that's probably the vast majority of parents sending their kids to Catholic schools across the country. The response over time has to be, Jesus isn't just a mascot. Jesus is the unum necessarium. He's the one thing necessary.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTague of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. As always, let's start with prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Almighty God, through the intercession of St. Ignatius Loyola, we ask that you pour forth your Holy Spirit upon us, a spirit of discernment, that we might hear your voice and obey your command. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Well, friends, it's said that in polite company, you don't want to talk about politics or religion because it leads to upset. What if you wanted to talk about police and race? What would that do to the conversation? I think the conversation would take a very serious turn in a hurry, and perhaps not a very calm one. I have an expert guest here who's been publishing some very interesting research on the issues of police and race. He's president and co-founder of Just Facts, a think tank dedicated to publishing rigorously documented facts about public policy issues. James Agresti, welcome to the Catholic Current.
Thank you for having me.
James, I want to start with a story I've been told very many times, broadly over the years, that Black parents in particular have to have with their children, especially with their boys, the talk. And the talk is along the lines of there's the reality of being pulled over by the police for the crime of driving while Black, that when you walk into a store, you're going to be viewed with suspicion as a likely shoplifter, that any police stop will almost certainly end in violence, and that on any given day, very many law enforcement officers, especially those who are white, put on their badge and their gun and look forward to hunting down and murdering in cold blood a young Black man. That's the story that's told not only in homes, I've been told, but it's certainly a story that's repeated very often in the media and by politicians. Have you heard similar accounts?
Obviously, I read and watch the news on a regular basis, and there are a lot of statements to that effect, along with anecdotes to support that storyline. I've heard it from people. I've heard it from a pastor. I recently saw an interview with somebody saying, hey, when I was a teen and I got my license, my dad gave me this talk. And he told me, if you get pulled over, make sure you put your hands on the top of the steering wheel where the police officer can see them. And guess what? I was given that same talk, too. It's only polite to a police officer and smart to protect yourself that you make sure you show them right away that you're not a threat to them, that your hands are exposed. So I don't see that as something that's white or black. I see it as common sense and courtesy and safety.
Right. Again, that issue of common sense. And, I've had friends who are in law enforcement, and, when you get out of the car, you just don't know what you're going to face. And so I want to have a happy outcome. I want the cop to go home to his family. I want to go home to my family. I want us all to live another day, and anything I can do to facilitate that so there's not misunderstanding, that would seem to me to be common sense. And yet there is a narrative that persists that people of color, African Americans especially, and in particular young Black men, are, every time they step out the door, they've got a police target on their back. Where does that narrative come from?
Well, I think it comes in large part from the media. I'll give you a prime example. The editorial board of the New York Times wrote, many police officers see Black men as expendable figures on the urban landscape, not quite human beings. So that is something that is taught explicitly by the press. It's taught in many classrooms. It's spoken as a fact, as if it's a presumed fact virtually everywhere in the public realm.
The New York Times, did they cite a source? Is there a police handbook that says such things, or is this an inference based on what?
So they actually did said, well, here's the evidence for this. And they cited what they called a grim report by ProPublica. It's a think tank, left-leaning think tank, showing that young black males in recent years were at a far greater risk, 21 times greater, of being shot dead by police than young white men. However, if you actually read the report, instead of taking the Times word for what it says says this explicitly. Many have pointed to our reporting as proof of police bias. That overstates our case. ProPublica found evidence of a disparity in the risks faced by young and black and white men, but this does not prove that police officers target any age or racial group. The data is far too limited to point to a cause for the disparity. So the thinking goes, well, if black youth are shot more than white youth, it has to be because the police are discriminatory towards black youth.
You know, I've never been a journalist, but I'm trained as an academic. I'm trained as a scholar. You're supposed to draw inferences and conclusions based on evidence. And if you misrepresent your sources, that's considered bad. Right? You know, if I were, say, on a doctoral dissertation committee and a student had misrepresented the data that way, I wouldn't accept the dissertation. I would consider sanctions against the students. But what happens when the media misrepresent or simply sloppy in the research?
There seems to be no accountability. I have reached out to the New York Times about numerous instances like this, and probably this particular one, I don't recall off the top of my head. I do have a record, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. And you just don't get a reply. I mean, this is as cut and dry as it gets here, where they're saying the source shows this, and the source is saying, no, we don't. It's pretty blatant. And you talk about misrepresenting a source. It's not uncommon for me to read, I don't know, more than a dozen peer-reviewed journal papers, which are supposed to be the gold standard of academic credibility, in the course of a week, sometimes even in the course of a day. And what I will typically do is try to dig back to that primary source to make sure that the paper is representing its sources properly. And I can't tell you how many times there is a material disconnect between what the one paper is saying and what the other paper they're citing actually said. So this isn't just a problem in the media. It's a problem that goes to the highest levels of academia in our society. And it all boils down to a lack of commitment to the truth.
Well, and I remember when that was considered, again, the gold standard is you follow the truth wherever it leads, and it's even associated with a scientific method. Friends, I'm speaking with James Agresti, president and founder of Just Facts, a think tank dedicated to publishing rigorously documented facts about public policy issues. James, this is a very controversial topic to talk about police and race and facts and evidence. You're not likely to get a lot of friends. You're not likely to be invited to the cool kids table for doing this. Why are you doing it?
Well, these issues have important consequences. So let's just play along with the narrative for a bit and say, hey, the police officers are targeting black people. They're attacking them. This is a systemic problem, to use the phrase systemic racism. Well, then it absolutely needs to be corrected because it's hurting people. Right. But what contrary, right? If these claims are not based in reality, if they're exploiting anecdotes, which is very common. I mean, we live in a nation with more than 300 million people, more than 800,000 law enforcement officers, unfortunately, last year, more than 20,000 murders. We typically average about 14 to 16,000. So there's no shortage of stories, anecdotes to make a case. But that is a complete logical fallacy. We have to look at the bigger picture to see if something is truly systemic. And if this narrative is untrue, well, what does it do? Well, we've seen some of the effects. It stokes strife and violence between people of different races. It forges victim mentalities. If you're under the mindset that the world hates you and is out to get you, how much time are you going to put into basically moving ahead with your life? Scientific studies have shown this creates weak self-control. It creates depression. So it's harmful to the person who believes a falsehood like this. Also, it misidentifies as the causes of poverty and crime and many other social ills. And if you don't know the cause, if you can't define the problem, you can't fix it. So it allows these things to proliferate.
Right. If you have a thoroughgoing perception that no matter what you do or don't do, you always can only be a victim, then again, things like self-control, delayed gratification, planning for the future, acting with hope rather than despair, those things are going to evaporate. Friends, we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with James Agresti, president and co-founder of Just Facts. We're talking about just the facts on police and race. In the next segment, we're going to talk about what do the numbers actually show. That's an important question. Remember, our rallying cry here at the Catholic Current is Christus Mundo, Mundus Christo, bringing Christ to the world and the world to Christ. We do it because our Lord says so, for the greater glory of God, the love of our neighbor, and the salvation of our own soul. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcasts. Let's keep the conversation going. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
The universe is filled with order from top to bottom. And it's a beautiful order. And not only is it beautiful, it's order that we can actually comprehend. And it's almost as if we have been made to be able to comprehend that order in the universe, to be able to contemplate it so that we can see maybe that purpose behind it.
Please visit Father Spitzer's website, magiscenter.com, to watch this beautiful and important video about purpose in God's creation. That's magiscenter.com.
You're listening to The Catholic Current with Father Robert Matej from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Stay connected with the show, our guests and topics, by following the show on Twitter and Gab. Just search for The Catholic Current.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert Matej of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. My guest today is James Agresti. He's president and co-founder of Just Facts, a think tank dedicated to publishing rigorously documented facts about public policy issues, and we're taking on the hot topics of police and race. James, about a year ago, you published an article suggesting that the numbers indicate that, in fact, blacks do not suffer disproportionately from police violence. And then more recently, you have an article from the spring regarding the NAACP making a claim about racial inequity and police stops for drivers. Let's start with what are the claims? What does the narrative say?
Well, the narrative is that, hey, black people, particularly young black men, are more apt to be shot by the police than young white men relative to their representation in the population. So, the figure that was given by ProPublica, about 23 times more likely. And again, the unsupported assumption from there is, well, that must be the result of racism. In 2008, a peer-reviewed journal called Social, Psychological, and Personality Science blew the lid off that narrative by pointing out the logical flaw in it. And the flaw is it uses the false assumption that white and black people commit life-threatening crimes at the same rates. And this is not to impugn people of any races. It's just to look at the data, because the fact is the vast bulk of people from both races, all races, are highly, highly unlikely to commit a violent crime. It's a small portion of each of those races that does that. But when you look at the national data sets on murder, non-negligent manslaughter, very serious violent crimes, in nearly every case, what you see is that whites are either more likely to be fatally shot by police, or police showed no significant disparity. So let's put some meat on those bones. On average, in a given year, black people are commit about 54% of all the murders in the United States, but they're only about 13% of the population, and 33% of people killed by police. And what this is showing, this raw data straight from the FBI, is exactly what this journal paper is saying, that they're not disproportionately targeted. In fact, what the data show is that police are more careful not to use lethal violence around black people than they are around whites, possibly because they know the consequences of that could be really, really bad.
Well, I read a story, I think it was in Portland, Oregon, I can't be certain. The police shot someone and an angry mob gathered, and the police dispersed the crowd with, "It's okay, the person we shot wasn't black," and then people went away. I don't think that's a good place for us to be as a society. More recently, the NAACP was making a claim about drivers and police stops. What was their claim?
Their claim is that black people are 5 times more likely to be pulled over unjustly than white people. So if you're a black driver, the whole narrative of driving while black, you are 5 times the chance of being pulled over unjustly than a white driver.
And what do the numbers actually show?
Okay, so this is the funny thing. I first saw this statistic presented in a Newsweek article by a reporter by the name of Jason Lemon. And he said, hey, the NAACP says this, and he linked to an article, which was another article he had written, which linked to another article he had written, which had no evidence or link to the NAACP website. So I go to the NAACP website, and there's the stat sitting right there. However, there's no support, no study, no documentation, no data to support it. So I email the NAACP saying, hey, can I please have the study that you're basing this on or the data? No reply. I call them the next day. No reply. I email them thereafter. No reply. So I'm like, okay, is there anything to support this? So I start doing some research, and I find a paper that actually has a study of unjust police stops. Let me just pull up the paper real quick so
Sure.
I can name the journal. Anyway, I can't put my hands on it quickly, but
Right.
it's the Journal of Social Issues. Got it right here.
Mm.
And basically what they did is they took a sample of graduate students in New York of different races and ethnicities, and they said, hey, we want you to log if you're pulled over by police in the upcoming 6 months, and we also want you to tell me if you were pulled over unjustly. And what the study found is that everybody was pulled over at about the same rate, in an unjust manner that they felt, there was no difference between blacks, whites, Latinos. They were all the same.
So how did they get that headline from that data set?
It remains a mystery. They won't answer. I did a pretty thorough search of the scholarly literature, and this is the only study I could find on unjust police stops. And there seems to be no basis to it at all. It just seems to be made up. There was another study that's tangentially related to this. This was a study done in the journal Justice Quarterly. It's older, but it was a study done in New Jersey, which several years back, I want to say even 2 decades, there was a complaint about racial profiling on the New Jersey Turnpike. And they were saying, hey, you're pulling over black drivers much more than white drivers. This must be discrimination. But what this study looked at is the circumstances under which these drivers were pulled over. And it found that police pulled people over who were going 15 miles above the speed limit regardless of what their race was, that the pullovers had nothing to do with the race of anybody, but the fact that they were exceeding the speed limit more than 15 miles per hour. So this is, again, the same thing. You can't say, hey, there's a racial disparity, ergo it must be racism. There may be many reasons for that disparity. And when you start digging down into the data, which I've done on numerous occasions, you know what the biggest correlation is? And I use the word correlation because you can't prove it's a cause. That's just the nature of social science. But the biggest correlation is leftism. Leftist attitudes about education, violence, personal responsibility, all of these factors that are correlated with these social ills, which may be why leftists are always seeking to blame racism, because the problems are actually associated with their policies and their mindsets.
Friends, I'm speaking with James Agresti. He's president and co-founder of Just Facts, a think tank dedicated to publishing rigorously documented facts about public policy issues. We're talking about the very sensitive and difficult issue of finding the facts on police and race. James, my observation is this, that there is something, as you know, there's something called confirmation bias, and we tend to be drawn toward those things that confirm what we already believe about the world. And that's a weakness in human nature. And one of the things that a good education is supposed to give you is a disinclination to not fall prey to that. And I think that takes discipline. And I myself have been guilty of saying, "Aha, I knew it," and forwarded something that I really should have double checked. And I've embarrassed myself among family and friends. So I'm very careful about that. And my academic training has really instilled that in me. I'm also aware of the fact that the business model for a lot of social media, news media, is you generate clicks and views by having incendiary headlines. What percentage of that is just human nature being sloppy and looking for the quick buck? And is that sufficient to explain what we've been seeing in recent years?
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard to get inside other people's heads, but like you, I have definitely noticed confirmation bias in myself. We're all guilty of it. In fact, one of the greatest scientists of all times, a fellow by the name of Joseph Lister, who invented the antiseptic procedures that made modern surgery what it is, said, when I was young, I used to think that prejudice was something that was peculiar to some people. I'm not talking about racial prejudice, but all kinds of prejudices, things we believe that were inherent. And he goes, as I've grown older, I found that we're all under its influence, and we must guard against it daily. So we all have a tendency to believe something that fits with the narrative we already believe and just blindly accept it. And, of course, to demand absurd, unreasonable standards of proof for anything that challenges our prior held beliefs. It's a natural human thing.
Right. And then there's also the Dunning-Kruger effect, wherein we assume that we're more expert and knowledgeable than in fact we really are. I'm reminded of a cartoon I saw, a gentleman reading a book, and the book says, most people expect to find confirmation bias, and the reader yells, "Aha, I knew it." And then he catches himself, and he just kind of sits and stares off into space. So tell us a little bit more about your organization, Just Facts. I know you said you have a background in engineering. I know they prize precision and accuracy. What moved you to set up the Just Facts organization?
So my brother set up a website at justfacts.com in the mid-'90s, and we just started putting some facts up there related to public policy issues. They were poorly documented, poorly written, but we started getting a following. And over the years, it progressed to the point where we finally we got a link from the government of Taiwan to our website, and I traced the link back and found that they had us on a list of U.S.-based think tanks amongst some pretty prestigious organizations and think tanks. And I thought to myself, wow, what if I turn this thing into a think tank? And long story short, 14 years later, here we are. This is my full-time work. We have four other employees. We've been cited in numerous academic journals and by governments and media outlets. And we've been able to have, I think, a very outsized impact for a relatively small organization, because we take our mission seriously. We go through great lengths to ensure that what we publish is indeed a fact and not the subject of our confirmation bias, not uncritically accepted. And this is something that academics struggle with more than other people sometimes. There's been a study, I forget exactly where it was published, showing that intelligence and education don't necessarily equate with rationality. In fact, there is an inverse relationship. And then one of my favorite quotes, which comes from MIT.
James, we're coming up on a break, so let's take up the thread of that in the next segment. Friends, when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with James Agresti, president and founder of Just Facts. We're talking about police and race. In the next segment, we're going to talk about how can we know and tell the truth. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcasts. Wherever you can find audio, you can find us. We're on over 100 platforms now. Grab the audio, follow the channel, write a 5-star review. We need to attract the attention of the algorithms so that we can get the attention that we deserve. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us.
This is The Catholic Current from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Catch up on an episode you've missed or share them with your family or friends. The Catholic Current is podcasted wherever you enjoy listening: Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app.
Jesus Christ, this is Father Robert McTeigue of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. We're talking about the sensitive issue of police and race. Our guest is James Agresti. He's president and co-founder of Just Facts, a think tank dedicated to publishing rigorously documented facts about public policy issues. James, just at the tail end of the segment, you said you had a favorite quote. Can you share that with us now, please?
Sure. So it's MIT physicist Victor Weisskopf, and it goes like this. An expert is somebody who knows more and more about less and less until finally they know everything about nothing.
Yes.
And this is a reference to the tendency of scholars to get so laser focused on a narrow part of an issue that they miss the big picture. Right. And I think that is a real problem in academia. It's a form of tunnel vision that can help you really hurt people because you're not looking at all of the factors that need to be weighed.
Well, at the risk of appearing self-aggrandizing, people wouldn't act like that if they had a really good philosophical education. But that is another topic for another time. But, my background is primarily in philosophy and also theology. And we talk a lot about how can we know the truth. And if we know the truth, then we have an obligation to tell the truth. And I know that people are inundated. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, after midnight or so, the television just went off the air. There was nothing to say. And you really couldn't find out about news until Walter Cronkite came on after dinner again. We've got a 24-hour news cycle. We're plugged in. We're surrounded by electronic media. If we want to hear anything about anything, we get hit with a fire hose. So we look for, who's wearing, who's the good guy saying the good words and who the bad guy is saying the bad words. And we just separate the sheep and the goats that way. And now we're being overwhelmed by the cult of experts. And there are some people who say, you know what, James, Father, I don't have to worry. I've got Snopes. I've got other fact checkers. I can just kick back. Snopes is a big organization. Why are you still in business? Why are you still trying? What's your take on Snopes and other fact checking groups that people like Facebook and Twitter want us to trust?
So when we get into the business of fact-checking, it's typically because no one else has addressed an issue properly. And sad to say, I can't tell you how often that occurs. And the primary culprits are often these big name fact checkers like Snopes and PolitiFact and factcheck.org, and particularly egregious is the Washington Post fact checkers, Glenn Kessler. We've published numerous articles about that. You can plug any of their names into our fact check website at justfactsdaily.com. But just to give you a simple example, and this is something that a high schooler could have done properly, that Snopes failed to do. So when Brett Kavanaugh was being confirmed to the U.S. Supreme Court, there were allegations he had sexually attacked a few women. And the newspapers and a lot of these fact checkers were saying, well, it's very, very rare for someone to make a false allegation of sexual harassment. And the clear implication was Kavanaugh is guilty. So I started digging into that literature and looking at some of these articles. And Snopes cited this paper in an academic journal saying, hey, this academic journal shows, I think they said around 5% of rape allegations turn out to be false. And I looked at that paper, had to pay to access it, there was a paywall on it, and found out it didn't say that at all. What it said is that is the bare minimum of cases, and potentially many more exist, including studies that show the rate could be as high as 40%. So Snopes took a bare minimum of 5% and made that around 5%. And this is the kind of thing you will see from these individuals over and over and over again. And there's always a common thread. You want to guess what that might be?
Surprise me.
The falsehoods, almost inevitably, in almost every case, 99 out of 100, support leftist narratives. This is not something that's random, simple, sophomoric mistakes like this. There's a pattern to them.
You know, that notion of the independent free press, that, you know, we're all, you know, that people are go into journalism to be H.L. Mencken and to just to tell the truth wherever it goes. You know, I've had people who spent careers in journalism who really tried to live that way, and they were very, very much outnumbered. And part of what concerns me is that it's not just a newspaper that you can pick up or put down, but the media outlets are in our ears and in our faces absolutely constantly, and that can lead, you know, to mob violence. You know, someone who's accused of doing something bad, and the erroneous address is shown up, and then, you know, someone's house is burned to the ground, and it was the guy next door who was being accused of the crime. So is it legitimate to be concerned that if there's a misrepresentation of fact, either by journalism, fact checkers, or social media, that there can be a kind of vigilante justice, either actual violence or kind of a social violence, someone who's drummed out of polite society or can't get a decent job anymore? Is that a concern of yours?
It's a reality. I mean, we've seen it time and time again, particularly with cancel culture. But on a more serious note about actual violence, I've documented several cases where people have murdered police officers and basically left suicide notes or made statements to the effect of, hey, this is a retribution for Michael Brown, whoever it may be, which, you know, as the Michael Brown case turned out, that the officer was defending himself. He acted in self-defense. Even the Obama Department of Justice determined that. The DNA evidence shows it. The witnesses show it. There was never a hands up, don't shoot, or anything even close to that. But I'm looking at a murder of 2 police officers in 2014, and this is what the murderer posted on Instagram before he killed them. I'm putting wings on pigs today. They take one of ours, let's take 2 of theirs. Shoot the police.
Oh, that can't be good. No. For all sorts of reasons, that can't be good. Friends, I'm speaking with James Agresti. He's president and co-founder of Just Facts. We're talking about the difficult and sensitive issue of police and race. So tell us, what do you do to make sure that you don't run afoul of confirmation bias? I know that, you know, as an academic, I can play the game of infinite footnotes, given me enough time, and I can have you doubt whether or not you've verified gravity. I know how to play the game, and then I think you've heard the phrase, to sea lion someone, that it is never enough. But what do you do? What are your sources? What are your standards? What are your procedures so that when a very contentious, volatile issue like police and race comes up, you're oriented towards what is factual? How does that work?
So over the 2+ decades that I've been running Just Facts, I've come to 7 what I call standards of credibility. It's a filter that we run all of our research through to ensure that it's accurate and presents a true picture of reality. Now, let me say this. We're not infallible. Nobody is except Christ and God. And we're nowhere near that. Mm-hmm. However, we do have a system for correcting errors, and we take it seriously. We make it right. But we recently launched, and your setup seems like a built-in advertisement for an initiative we recently launched. I don't know if you're aware of it, but it's called Just Facts Academy, and it's located at justfactsacademy.org. And it's a series of videos that explain these standards, what they are, why they're important, and how to apply them. It's directed towards high school and college students to teach them how to conduct proper research and separate fact from fiction. And just to rattle off some of them, one is super important. It's comprehensiveness. It's making sure you're looking at all the facts, not just those that confirm a certain agenda, using primary sources, getting back to the actual information, vetting raw data. There's a number along those lines, and I have to say the videos are really entertaining. Even if you're not a student, they're quite amusing, but really substantive and really useful, especially in this day and age where people are inundated with information and misinformation.
When I was teaching undergrads, and I would make reference, say, to a recent court decision or a recent vote in Congress and so on, the students had absolutely no awareness. And I grew up, I was reading journals and newspapers in high school, and they said, Father, we're just so overwhelmed by information, and we find no one trustworthy. We just assume that everyone is lying to us, and then we just unplug. Have you encountered that among young people?
I've encountered that among people of all ages. I had a woman, I'd say she was 60 years old. I've known her for 20, 30 years, call me one day and just go, Jim, how do you find out what's true? Like she was just lost, bewildered with everything that was conflicting things that were being thrown at her. And there's really a good way to handle this, a good mentality. And so we're not overwhelmed. And that's this. And I hate to say this as a believer, I don't hate to say it, but it's a word you don't typically hear from a Christian, which is stay agnostic. For everything you hear, your first reaction should not be it's true, it's false. It should be maybe yes, maybe no. And for the things that are really, really important, do your due diligence. Go to justfactsacademy.org, learn those research skills, and truly vet it before you make a decision. Because if we make decisions with bad information, we can hurt a lot of people, ourselves, family members, or if we're in a position of power, many other people.
Well, Jim, I want to affirm that because, again, as an academic, as well as someone who's a priest and a theologian, faith is not the same as credulity. And being enthusiastic about whatever blandishment comes your way, that isn't real faith, and that can only lead people to a bad end. I've spent most of my adult life in education in the classroom, either in the seat as a student or at the podium as a professor, and I've become aware of the steady decline of skills over time among undergraduates and sadly even graduates as well. I think there's something broken about the way we're teaching the younger generations. Do you share that concern?
I absolutely do, and your experience as a professor is mirrored by the empirical data that looks at the skills that college graduates have once they graduate with, the skills of the society in general. Now, when I say skills, I mean the ability to use math and logic to come to correct conclusions. They are suffering immensely. And concurrent with that, there's been a tremendous drop in academic standards leading to grade inflation. So people are thinking they're brilliant. Hey, I'm straight A's, when really that A is the same as a C a couple decades back. So you're not only breeding ignorance, but you're tossing in arrogance with it, which are either one is bad on its own. Put them together, it's a really horrible combination.
Right. I recall reading a young lady, I think she was in Michigan. She graduated as a valedictorian of her high school class, thought she was all that in a bag of chips, went to college and found out that she couldn't do basic math and didn't know that she couldn't do basic math. And she ended up suing the school district. I don't know what became of her. Friends, when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with James Agresti, president and co-founder of Just Facts. We're talking about the sensitive and controversial issue of facts regarding police and race. The next time, we're going to talk about how much does error cost? That's a really important question. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Be part of the conversation. Follow what we're following by following us on Gab. That's gab.com. Our channel is The Catholic Current. Everything you need to take this conversation to your family and friends, we give to you. Together, we really can take it around the world, and we need to. We can do it together. We cannot do it without you. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Please do stay with us.
This is Dave Palmer, one of your hosts for the upcoming Station of the Cross on-air fall appeal taking place September 27th through October 1st. As an Apostles Club supporter with your gift of $1,560 or $130 per month, you'll receive a St. Joseph prayer-framed print, which will be customized with your family's name and include a crest and prayer of protection to St. Joseph. You'll also receive Father Calloway's book entitled Consecration to St. Joseph, a special St. Joseph rosary made in Italy, a booklet entitled Favorite Prayers to St. Joseph, a St. Joseph prayer magnet, and a Christmas CD by J.J. Wright entitled O Emmanuel. To donate, call 1-877-711-8500, go to thestationofthecross.com, use the donation page of your iCatholic Radio app, or return the envelope from our recent fall appeal mailing. I look forward to being with you September 27th through October 1st on the Station of the Cross.
After today's broadcast, go to the Catholic Current show page on thestationofthecross.com for info on today's guests, the show resource links, and to sign up for our weekly email of upcoming shows.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTague of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. My guest today is James Agresti, president and co-founder of Just Facts, a think tank dedicated to publishing rigorously documented facts about public policy issues. We're talking about the sensitive matters of facts in relation to police and race. James, we have already alluded to some of the deleterious effects of misrepresenting the facts, that if we inculcate a status of victimhood upon a sizable portion of the population, that doesn't encourage planning for the future, for hope, for cooperation, for building of families and businesses and churches, but can generate instead very harmful behavior. I think the evidence is in on that. I've heard that in a number of instances now, that even before the defund the police movement gave momentum, that police were reluctant to become engaged unless absolutely necessary, for fear that something untoward will happen, will be caught from a particular camera angle, and then the officers' lives are ruined. Have you heard anything to that effect?
Well, I think there's data that clearly supports that. So there's a left-leaning group called the Center for Policing Equity, and they did a study about the use of police using lethal force and force during arrests. And what they show is that the police officers are about 42% more likely to apply lethal force when arresting a white person than a black person. And I think it is a result, can't prove it, but it makes sense that it's a result of this mindset like where, hey, I better be really careful here because this could be career-ending or it could end my life, like the officer who shot Michael Brown, where he's essentially in hiding, and he did nothing wrong in that case. The data is crystal clear on that. But here he's lost his job and is essentially forced to live in isolation because of a situation where he did something in full view of everyone and did it properly and is still being demonized for it. In fact, Cori Bush recently brought it up, I think yesterday in a talk on CNN. She was like, we still haven't gotten justice for that death. So she's essentially got a bounty on that guy's head.
Yeah, I don't know what justice means in that particular case. I've been working in media for a few years. I've been writing for a number of years. Intelligent, sober conversation is important to me, and one of the reasons that I'm with the Catholic Current is I want to restore the lost art of intelligent conversation. I want to move into something that's speculative, something that's hard to measure, and maybe something grasped more intuitively. There's the old saw that when you go to a dinner at someone's house for the first time, you don't talk about religion and politics. I think very often people elect not to talk about police and race as well. There is the reality of self-censorship. I know content producers who use euphemisms lest they get booted off of YouTube, or a Patreon withdraws their patronage, etc. Now, it's impossible to measure that. You can't go around and say, what are the things you didn't say? And yet I believe that there are people who are so afraid of being vilified by a mob that they don't want to say anything. A case in point, Amy Coney Barrett was going through the hearings to be appointed to the Supreme Court, and she used the phrase sexual preference, which until she used that at that hearing was a socially acceptable phrase. And then overnight, the dictionaries online changed, and then it became hate speech. So even if you had an app that was updated in real time of don't say this or say it this way or that way, it would stifle free discourse. Is that a concern of yours?
Anytime people are stopped from speaking the truth about anything important, people are going to get hurt. That is the history of mankind. And when people say, hey, I won't be the person to speak it, you're essentially putting that hurt on someone else in many cases and allowing it to amplify. Just look at this issue we're talking about right now, about police violence against African Americans. If you say something volatile like, hey, the whole Black Lives Matter movement is a farce because it really isn't interested in saving black lives and it demonizes the entire police based on the actions of a few, that could set off a firestorm in certain companies. Mm-hmm. But the fact is that statement is true. It is true, and the damage that has been done by people afraid to speak up and say something is enormous. And most of that damage, by the way, comes on black people because the police pull back. And we're seeing this in real time right now, that murders are increasing in these neighborhoods. And the groups, the places where the Black Lives Movement has been most active have shown the greatest increases in murders. So to go along with an agenda just for fear of not being, or for fear of being lambasted, I think is somewhat cowardly. Now, let me say this. There's a time and a place.
Sure. Right?
We don't want to be flamethrowers and alienate people, particularly as Christians. We want to build bridges. We want to reach people, and you can't do that if you're obnoxious. Mm-hmm. But there's a way to say things nicely and to still speak the truth.
Right. And that's part of the rallying cry of our network here, the Station of the Cross, is the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. And sometimes the truth is hard to hear, and sometimes the truth is unexpected. When I taught a course on rhetoric, there was an essay we read about, loving words in a culture of lies. How do we begin to turn it around? I mean, I think we're largely on a path that is not leading to a good place. Alexander, how do we make the U-turn?
I get a lot of people asking me, what can I do? Mm-hmm. And a lot of, to stem what they view as the deterioration of our culture and our nation. And this is something that everybody can do. They can speak up with love. Because what happens is, and this is proven by numerous social science studies, is that when one person speaks up and says the uncomfortable but true thing, other people will too. Mm-hmm. The quintessential example is the Milgram experiments of the 1960s, where they staged a scenario where people were being electrocuted to death. It was done with volunteers, and most of the people would not stop it because they were under the authority of a doctor in a lab coat, and until one person spoke up. And if one person spoke up, then the vast majority of people would speak up too. So we can do something by being first to speak up. And of course, before we open our mouths, that requires that we have the facts, we have the truth, and we're not adding to the problem by, number one, spreading untruths, or number two, alienating people because we're not nice when we say these things.
Right. There is a book called Crucial Conversations, and one of the ways of clearing the hurdle of crucial conversation is there has to be a firm conviction of mutuality of respect and mutuality of purpose. And we might have disagreement and conflict, but if we view each other as opponents, we're going to fight to win rather than to discover the truth together. And this is a problem that goes all the way back to Socrates, at least. James Agresti of Just Facts, thank you for a very stimulating conversation. We're going to be linking to all the resources that you had suggested. I look forward to another conversation on the air. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time and the questions you asked. I'm Jesuit Father Robert McTague, your host here every day at the Catholic Current. Join us. We're going to have another Timely Tuesday. A lively guest and I will have a conversation about hot headlines affecting the church and the world. In the last segment, wrapping it up, it's you and me sharing timely thoughts on what we've learned. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Take this conversation to your family and friends. Together, we'll take it to the whole world. Through the intercession of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, may mighty God bless you, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Go in peace, and please pray for me.
Thank you for listening to this podcast brought to you by thestationofthecross.com, a listener-funded nonprofit organization. If this podcast has helped you in your spiritual journey, please prayerfully consider donating at thestationofthecross.com by calling 1-877-888-6279 or through our free iCatholic Radio mobile app.